Yeah.
expert, kind of like you're saying, like, you've never met anyone else. Like, I mean, everyone and their dog has a political science degree, it seems. So it's like you kind of have this specific niche. So you're based in Edmonton right now. So right now, just using Edmonton as an example, like, I guess, what is kind of the vision for housing? Because again, almost every city has like homelessness, like issues or unhoused issues and things like that. So I guess, like, what is kind of the, I guess, approach that you take with the government to try to solve some of those problems?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in Edmonton, and I would suggest that this is not just Canada wide, but
Hmm.
internationally. Like I'm associated with the Chartered Institute of Housing Canada. I'm on their education committee, helping to
Hmm.
educate the whole new set of housing professionals over through Canada. In terms of what is needed in the world of housing is just simply bigger supply and more
Hmm.
affordability. So right now, you Edmonton is a city of 1.1 million people, and we are, just in my organization, we have a housing stock of around 5,400 homes. We have
Hmm.
7 available units. That's number 7. That's how in
Wow.
demand this housing is. Um, we're in a time of real big need. And like I said, I suggest that that's not just Edmonton, that is not, and again, not just province wide, not Canada wide, but we have an international housing shortage for affordable housing.
Hmm.
So the advocation that is done within Civida, we have very good partnerships with the city of Edmonton. We have good partnerships with the the government of Alberta. And we have formed really good relations with other housing management bodies across the country and the federal government and CMHC. So we're talking to them all the time about what our needs are. We have research departments looking at what the demography is for the future, looking at what we plan, trying to win grants and any funding opportunities we can that we can build and develop, but also any programs we can help people to live well on the private sector. So we provide housing, but we also provide housing benefits, which is cash payments to assist people to live within private accommodation. So,
Hmm.
it's all housing related things, but we have good relationships with all 3 orders of government. We're investigating how we work better with private developers. We're investigating any other housing opportunity we can get hold of. And that housing continuum is long. So you have homelessness or houselessness on one end, and you would technically have like home ownership at the other end. Where Civita
Hmm.
sits is in that it's in a little spot where we overlap between community housing up to mixed market rental housing. So we're in quite a wide part of that housing continuum where we're helping people who have been in dire housing need.
All right, Stacey Houston, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
This definitely one of the more different parent teacher interviews that I've had in teaching so far. But yes, I did get to have the pleasure of teaching Oliver like 1.5 semesters. I think he switched about
Yeah.
halfway through in his grade 11 one, so it was nice to have him in the grade 12 one. But we were just talking before that we were talking about how you had completed a degree in housing in the UK. And to me, I guess when I imagine like a housing degree, I think of like a political science, finance, like kind of combination. But I guess one, what kind of sparks the interest into housing, and like what did the degree kind of entail?
It's like I'm literally the only person I know who very deliberately set out to be educated and have a career in housing. So that's not
Hmm.
a surprise. So what sparked my interest was from a young age. I grew up in not a super rich neighborhood in Northeast
Hmm.
England. And from a lot of my neighborhood were people who lived in what they called council housing in England.
Hmm.
Council housing would be for those folks who may be on a lower income, who may not be able to afford to rent or buy in the private sector. And the council housing is a big housing provider in England, very much bigger than what it is in Canada.
Hmm.
And I was interested in having a career in housing Originally, I was looking at social work, but it just wasn't for me. I felt like my personality didn't match as well to social work, although social work does happen to be a large part of my job.
Mhm.
And I was interested in the human services, and housing was a really good fit because it brought a balance in education between that social work aspect, that,
Mhm.
human services aspect towards a career, but also we looked at housing law, real estate, built environment, and a huge part of this was human geography, demographics, about how you plan housing for future generations and what you would need in future, and how housing had to change to match how demography changes. So as
Mhm.
people age, how do you amend housing so that you have enough housing supply for those folks who may have less mobility? How you plan for families who may have children with disabilities? How you plan for young people? How, if I had known this with a crystal ball, how you plan for people working at home through a global pandemic?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it brought about quite a nice balance of interest for me in all of those different areas. So that's why I chose to do a degree in housing studies. And I completed that at the University of Northumbria in Newcastle in the late 90s. I graduated
Mhm.
from my degree in 1999 and then followed it
Mhm.
up with postgraduate studies in broader social sciences. So I
Okay.
guess if you put me in a box, I'm a human services person at heart.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess like you go into human service or housing and you talk about like the human demography and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like what were kind of like the courses that you took? I don't mean to get like too academic here, and obviously
No,
that's what I
that's
like
okay.
talking
Yeah.
about. But like what are some of the surprise courses where you were like, I would never have even thought that was like a thing to learn about or think about? Like what were the
Yeah.
like most
Super
unique ones?
interesting. So some things were around housing law and legislation. There was accountancy and capital budget planning, as well
Mm-hmm.
as learning about the British welfare state. So looking at how
Mm-hmm.
social housing formed itself, how in the late 40s and the social sciences aspect of it was how we were looking at homes for heroes following the war efforts and the work that went into the history of building social housing and sustaining social housing and the budget models around how government helps to fund housing in all of these different tenures. So a lot of the courses were built up from, history, finance and accounting and all sorts of different things that add to that whole world that is actually my whole career now is built up
Mm-hmm.
of all of those different things. So it was a very good foundation for future career. Yeah. But
Interesting.
I
Because
acknowledge
even
it was very slim career choice. I do realize
well,
that.
because it definitely well again you kind of take the risk of being very narrow in what you study, but it's also you can become like kind of a soul
So they may have been houseless. They may have come from a program. They may have been in couch surfing situations. But we also might be helping people who just need a bigger place, or they're fleeing
Mhm.
domestic violence or racial issues or problems. So we're in that space in terms of community housing, but we're also in the mixed income space where we have market units as well, but market units that remain affordable within the city that you're living in. You might have to have a job to be able to afford to live in the market units, or you might be a student at local universities. But we straddle across those three sort of areas, and we're advocating every day for getting funding to expand any one of those different areas.
Mhm. So yeah, so much there that I want to go into, and I guess like one of the first ones that because again you're kind of seeing like the economic strand, the political strand, kind of like interweaving together a little bit. I guess how would you kind of respond then to like people that would say it's not like if you give a homeless individual a home, like it'll make their problems go away, but like it's more of like a personal issue. I guess like how would you respond to someone making a claim like that?
Yeah, I would struggle with
Hmm.
that claim because someone who has previously been homeless needs a lot more support than a roof over the head.
Hmm.
Um, Having said that, housing is the foundation for making improvements in other parts of your life. Like if you don't have a home that you can afford to live in, it's unlikely that, your children can be successful in school. They don't have anywhere that they can sit and do homework. They don't have anywhere they can study. They don't have anywhere they can rest or have clean or be clean. So as much as having been houseless before and then getting a home is a massive, massive step. And I do genuinely believe that housing is the foundation for the rest of your life.
Mhm.
We would always try and introduce community supports as well to those families who we are helping lift up so high. So it's, for those folks who, when we move people into our housing, it's done on a priority basis based on housing need. We move people into our housing and then we would meet with them to discuss what else they need help with. Do they need help with food security? Do they need help with social supports? Do they know how to enroll their kids in a school? Do they know where the local supermarkets are? Can we introduce you to somebody who can help you fill in some forms? How do we help you secure whatever benefits that you're entitled to? So it's not just the housing, it's that wraparound supports that we help people with too. And we'll make referrals and soft handoffs to all those other agencies that we're partnering with to help that happen. So housing is really super important. I would say the most important, but it's not the only necessary thing. So we work closely at Civida here with a lot of our other partners in the local area to make sure that people can be successful, not just in their tenancies, but with building assets, building their lives up, and hopefully moving on and leaving the properties for the next family that needs.
How do you go about like developing the priority like criteria?
Sure, good question. So in our community housing program, which is the majority of the housing that we manage here at Civida, so we have around 4,400 or so community housing units. The government actually has legislation on how we judge priority, how we adjudicate priority. So it's called the Social Housing Accommodation Regulation, and there are equivalents around the other provinces. This one is specific to Alberta. And it lays out different categories. And these categories give you points. And the higher points you have, the higher level of housing you have, and the higher chance of getting housing. So an example of that would be you get points if you're paying a high percentage of your income as rent. So if you get $1,000 a month and your rent is $700 a month, that would be a high percentage of rent geared to your income. So you would get higher points for the more income you pay in rent in terms of a ratio. That would be one category. We now have points for targeted populations. So if you're a newcomer or you are fleeing abuse or you are a member of the LGBTQ community, you get points, or you're Indigenous. So those groups who have genuinely been hard to access housing groups, they would have a slightly higher pointage for their priority to help that stabilize those communities. You would also get points if you're based on the existing condition of your current accommodation, that sort of thing. So we look at it in different categories of housing need. We total up the point score. The person with the highest points is offered the next available unit in a size that suits them in an area where that they want to live. So
how long do people typically stay in the units?
So I was actually looking at those statistics this morning. We have one tenant who's been with us for 50 years, literally since we opened the doors.
50?
Yeah, 50 whole years. Yeah,
Okay.
we celebrated our 50th birthday like 2 years ago. And someone has been with us since we put the name above the door. Other than that, we have an average of around 2 years. And that's very recent. People used to stay with us a lot longer. But now the average is 2 to 3 years. And we're hoping that in that 2 to 3 years, and that's in our community housing program, our most in demand, most need, highest subsidized program. But yeah, we're hoping people move on to bigger, better things when they leave us. So Yeah.
So, why do you think in a time of housing becoming more difficult to get at or to possess, the times are getting shorter that they're actually staying in the community housing?
I feel like some of that is statistical, honestly. I think
Okay.
most of our units are 2 and 1 bedroom, which would be your most transient population. So as more people move out, we find that people stay longer in the townhomes. So people who've lived in our 3 or 4 or 5 bedroom homes
Oh, okay.
would stay longer than those folks who maybe live in our apartment buildings, for example.
Mhm.
So yeah, I there's in comparison to a few years ago, there are so fewer people leaving our larger homes now because they're in a home that they can afford and they're stable.
Yeah.
So
Is it fair to say, because I'm thinking of the show Friends,
mhm,
where I remember there's like Chandler and Monica talked about their apartment being rent controlled and it was a
yeah,
freaking steal. Like I remember, is
yeah.
that kind of the similar concept that's kind of being played with your guys' community housing? I'm not trying to like
No, it's
turn popular culture onto
no,
it, but
that's okay. No, oh, good. I'm very familiar with Friends. The so rent control is not a thing in Alberta, just to be clear. Like there is no
Mhm.
maximum rents that can be charged, similar
Okay.
to what Monica and Chandler paid. But but in community housing, there's a formula for how much rent we charge on community housing programs. And this is across the province under that same legislation I just spoke about.
Okay.
So a family would pay 30% of their total household income for rent.
Mhm. Okay.
Or if the family is claiming income support or the individual are on income support, there's a set fee amount of rent that would be charged to them. So
Okay.
30% is the national number, accepted national number, but what you should be paying in terms of you shouldn't be paying more than 30% of your income as your housing costs. So
Mhm.
that's how that calculation is made. So we would take, for a family to qualify for housing, they would send all of their income information. We total that all up. We take out a couple of exclusions. So we don't include kind of the child benefit in that 30% calculation, for example. And then we'd set the rent at what 30% of that total adjusted income would be. And
Hmm.
that's how much they pay. And then every year we ask people to produce their income information and we adjust the rent to what 30% of their new income is. So the good thing is as people's income hopefully increases,
Mhm.
their rent remains affordable, but they're still paying a fair amount of rent the whole way until they get over the threshold of what is qualified for a social housing unit. And then hopefully they move on.
Because as you say that, and I'm not, it's not me saying this, but I can honestly hear the left and right
Mm-hmm.
wing of the political
Yeah.
spectrum kind of speaking in my ear. So, is it a common criticism of this to like you're almost like incentivizing people to not like make more because then they can stay in that housing? Like, is that something that you guys hear often?
We do hear it.
Hmm.
I guess what I would say to people is if people are in need of a home, then they
Hmm.
should apply for our programs.
And why can't there be like a leveling to that, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's rent is very expensive,
Hmm.
and if people are demonstrating to Civida that they have a need, a genuine housing need, whether that be financial housing need or whether that be some other type of housing need, then
Hmm.
they should qualify for the programs and be able to afford to live there.
Hmm.
In terms of incentivizing people to stay, I would say it's actually assisting people to asset build or earn more money or increase their opportunities so that they can move on when they're
Hmm.
properly stable and they can afford to do so.
Hmm. And so you mentioned, I heard, sorry, I heard two figures, 4,400 or 5,400 units. Is
So
that
we have
who?
5,400 total units.
Okay.
4,400 or so of those are the government owned community housing units.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
the
so
most.
if you had, yeah, if you had your magic wand, how many units within 1 year would kind of like solve the housing in Edmonton? Maybe just for an
So
example.
I can give you stats from Civida's wait list. So
Hmm.
currently eligible families on our wait list are in excess of 7,000. And those are the ones who have applied. and we have a net new set of 400 or so applications per month.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so
And
these people, for the most, sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just to give you an idea, we move in less than 25 families per month. So we are helping a tiny percentage of the folks that are currently eligible for our programs. And we're doing our best to get these units turned over quickly. We're doing our best to make sure the right people are living in our units, because we're, obviously following all of the legislation. It's just really tough because there's just not enough affordable housing in the city.
And so is it, like, to what extent, and I don't mean to use a classic phrasing question there, like, to what extent is there resistance to building housing? Because I almost feel like every side of the political spectrum, every government agency is talking about this is our main problem. So why is it then still so difficult to, like, actually build and expand?
I don't think it's difficult to build and expand. It's difficult to pay for what is affordable. I think you could build apartments that would be full. It's a demographic of people who can't afford that market level rent. So I don't think it's necessarily a resistance to building. It's a need to build more for more affordability. And when you build for more affordability, you need more grants that are not paybackable. So it's like we need grants rather than loans, and we need affordable building materials, and we need affordable mortgages, and we need affordable financing, without us having to push rents so high up so that we can afford to pay the mortgages or afford to pay the financing or afford to keep the building operating. Because with every so give you an idea of the property management cycle, is each of the buildings that you build, when you operate it, it has to fund itself. So if you had a building that cost $50 million and you managed to get, $25 million in government funding, regardless of which order of government. So say you have $25 million that is grant funded. You have to finance the $25 million. To finance the $25 million, to keep the lights on, to clean the hallways, to remove the snow, to cut the grass, to keep it heated, to make sure it's secure, is all funding that we're paying out of rental income. So your rental income has to be enough that you're covering not just the financing and mortgaging, but the operation of those buildings too.
Wow.
Yeah. So it can be complex in the space that more affordable housing providers are in, because you have to, at the end of the day, this is a very British phrase in housing, the buildings have to wash their own face.
Okay, yeah.
So it can be tough in this spot.
So do you, or like the building companies, I know like myself, like I just bought a home recently, thankfully, and pardon?
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I don't have to drive to the school to set up my podcast thing anymore. I can just do it right in my basement, which is very nice.
Perfect.
But like when it comes to interest rates, like that was something I kind of always knew about. And then you kind of get into the nitty gritty of the numbers and you're like, okay, like you actually see how substantial even just like 1% can be.
Yeah.
Is that something that you guys get a break on with like bank loans
yes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes, I know. I mean, interest rates affect not just in mortgaging and financing. Interest rates affect in terms of vendor contracts and service contracts and all of that. But yeah, the percentage interest does affect us in terms of our borrowing too. Absolutely, it does. And it's a big deal if you borrow at 2.4% or 5.9%. It's just like it would be your average homeowner. We'd be affected by that. But like I said, the biggest hit on housing organizations in terms of inflation or in terms of interest rates would be as well on those service contracts. So the people that you pay to cut the grass, the materials that you use to renew a kitchen, the timber that you use to fix the fencing. So what we're seeing right now is buildings have to wash their own face, but it's costing us more to wash our own face. Yeah. The difference between an organization like the one I work for or a private developer is a private developer can put up the rents. we know we can't do that because we have a certain demography of people who can afford to live there at the rate that's calculated. To try and make these units as affordable as possible so people have a stable, safe and stable home. So we went on a position where, okay, well, you know what, as an operator, it's costing us an extra $500 a month to remove the snow. Well, let's just put everybody's rent up by $50.
$15. Yeah.
We're not in that space. So it's different in terms of affordability, and it's different in terms of who you are as a landlord and what your mandate is as a landlord.
And so one of the things that I've noticed is that it seems like I kind of got into the workforce and housing market at the absolute worst time. That's what everyone tells me anyway. So even for yourself, like you've been in it for 25 years, kind of in this lane. How have, like, I guess what, I don't want to paint too broad of a question, but I guess how have the challenges of the last like 5 to 6 years been different from like what your career started with? Like, is it more intense now? Is it like, what is more intense about it, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of comparison, two very different cities I've worked as a housing professional in, but similar challenges in terms of affordability, similar challenges in terms of helping the most vulnerable folks in society. But if you're asking, the last COVID was tough. If I can, as a housing professional, COVID got really hard, and it got hard in a number of ways. And I've been in Edmonton in housing since 2016. And it was never not hard, I'm going to be honest. But when COVID hit, it was tough in terms of we had to rethink everything we did. We had to rethink how we worked. We had
like in what way?
So all of our standard operating processes, like we went through a stage where, housing is a lot about meeting people, housing a lot about touring people who you've met before through homes and signing them up for leases and finding out all about them and getting government information, getting government documents and taking care of tenancies. And all of that, we had to analyze every single process that we did to make sure it was safe for our tenants, our applicants, and our staff. That was tough. Then we hit a really difficult time in terms of social issues. So we struggled with mental health crisis. We struggled with the opioid crisis in Edmonton. We were struggling with people just upping and leaving. We lost a lot of tenants during COVID. Whoever was, people who were from out of town or different countries left. So we struggled with vacancy for a little while in our near to market programs. So we were left with that. We're still dealing with mental health crises and safety and security issues in Edmonton. And that's not, again, it's not just a Civida issue, nor an Edmonton issue. I would suggest that this is international. We're still dealing with people who are struggling with their mental health or addictions or folks who might need those extra supports, and we're still trying to catch them and put those supports in place for people. But that manifests itself in many different ways. We are struggling with increased levels of people who don't have a home, who are congregating within lobbies of apartment buildings that do. We're struggling with that and balancing that with the needs of safety, but with the needs of those folks who actually need housing and for getting some level of support to those. So it's been a tough time. And if you compound that with, folks' struggles on lack of affordability on the private market, which is pushing more people into the space, and the demand that we're seeing right now in terms of how much need there is out there, it's tough to only be able to help this much. And and we know that it's the demand is going to continue to climb, and the volume of work that's coming our way is going to continue to climb. And we have to try and balance that with the resources that we have available, and in terms of people and dollars. Yeah, and it can be difficult. Having said that, I feel like we do good work.
Yes.
And I feel like we do good work trying to help as many people as we can with what we have. But yeah, there's been some times in the last few years it was like our teams sure, like teachers too, everyone was just exhausted there for a while.
Well, it's not even that. It's almost like everyone kind of knows there is good work being done, but it just seems like that good work is always has like this like background of doom and gloom of
Right.
like, even though you're doing the good work, you're doing the good work because of there are these problems. So it's like the problems kind of have to exist for the good work to be done, which can be kind of hard to wrap your head around a bit as you kind of keep pushing through it. But yeah, 100%. Again, I guess it's to me as kind of being like late 20s now. Like, I guess my whole life I've always thought about, like you hear about people that are unhoused or homeless, and you hear about people struggling with addiction kind of through all the generations. So I guess it's like, why is it so different? Why is it like the main political issue we hear? But now we've touched on that here throughout the, like, I guess, episode here today. Um, when it comes to kind of like other buzzwords, I guess I hear like red tape. So I guess like what do you think of when you think of red tape when it comes to your kind of profession?
Yeah. Red tape, it's a difficult one in
Mm-hmm.
terms of bureaucracy. And,
Mm-hmm.
like I said, we have an excellent funding relationship with all three orders of government, and
Mm-hmm.
we like to keep it that way. But things take time. Things like
Yeah.
public procurement rules take time. So, there's bureaucracy in a lot. Some is needed, some could be trimmed. And, I think we strive every day to become more efficient and try and, negotiate with those where there might be red tape. In terms of red tape for building and development homes, it's a minefield.
Yeah.
You're talking about planning, you're talking about community consultation, you're talking about planning, you're talking about a lower income landlord coming to a neighborhood that's never seen it. There's red tape that manifests itself in a whole bunch of different ways, as well as in the procurement, the planning, the financing side of things, the advocating for funding. There's a lot of hoops to go through, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So
I
this
do feel like
sorry.
it's a collective effort to reduce those,
Yeah.
though, I have to say.
Mm-hmm. This might be a stupid question. Like what would be, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you have an example of a time where you're like, this is a bureaucratic protocol that actually ends up getting kind of wiped away and you're like, now this is so much easier? Like, does anything come to mind when I
I
ask
mean,
that?
the yeah, it's a difficult one. Like,
That you can share?
um, I guess I can talk about my time with a previous employer.
Yeah.
Um, it's it was we needed just to get somebody housed,
Yeah.
which you would think would be like the quickest thing in the world to do.
Yeah.
But we have to make sure that we have that person's income on our files.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a bureaucratic process, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
So for us to be able to offer someone a home who we know needs it, we have to ask them to produce all of the documentation that they have. And then we decide what we're going to use out of that documentation to validate what we already know to be true in terms
Mm-hmm.
of how much that person has as an income. The family was on a set amount of government benefit, and we had to push this person through hoops of having to go to their local benefits office, get them to print out the benefit stub, for example, come back to us, show us their benefit stub, which we already knew because they offered us their bank account statement, then double check that, then go through hoops and then file that somewhere, and then they were then delayed another month where we could do it. There was a very simple way of somebody saying, this is how much money I have in my bank account, this is how much money goes in every month. Great.
Mm-hmm.
But instead we had to put a person through a whole bunch of different steps and a whole bunch of unnecessary steps to get to the point where we could potentially have somebody so that they can demonstrate how poor they actually are, which is dreadful. And then potentially make the person
Yeah.
poorer by making them get 2 transit buses to get to where they need to be to come back. But yeah, that's one very, very small example. In terms of bureaucratic processes, it's the world of working in in a industry where things can get so big. So you might be dealing with the federal government, and the federal government also dealing with 100 other housing organizations or housing bodies, and you're one of many, and accepting the
Yeah.
fact that the grant submission that you did might not necessarily be the most important grant submission that's on somebody else's desk. Those things
Yeah.
I find frustrating because you're living it daily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you're almost in like a weird position of advocacy without like it's like you're really just trying to do your own job, but then you have to like you're asking to do your job, which is a weird like kind of situation to
Yeah.
be in.
And then balancing that with the needs of, the other housing management body down the road in Calgary. Like, there's only a finite amount of money available. And,
Yeah.
if we want it and Calgary want it and Red Deer want it and Grand Prairie need it and Fort McMurray need it. And then you have Fires in Jasper and they need it. And, it's, you have to balance with the need that we see walking through our lobby doors every day with, being a good civil servant in that you want the funding to go to the right places, to the right people, to fill the right gaps.
And do you almost get the social worker, or I guess like that type of field? Burnout's the wrong word, but I guess the like seeing someone that you really want to get housing not get it, because that's
Yeah,
something that happens like often
frustrated
to you
every
as well.
day. Yeah, we approach housing from a trauma informed perspective too. And that frustration about not being able to help as many people as what we like is very real. And there is a lot of, we do see it's well known in the human services that people do have high level burnout. They have empathy fatigue. You take on somebody else's trauma some days, and it can be hard for our frontline teams. For sure, it can. And you want to do everything you can, but at the same time, we have to try and coach people that at the end of their day, when they leave, they can go home and have and live their own lives.
Yeah.
It's a very tough balance between, I've been in the industry for a very long time. I guess it's easier for me to talk about than maybe a more junior member of staff. But we see it. We see that in our teams, and we have to, as leaders in the housing professional, watch out for that and make sure that our staff get the training and support and debriefing that they need, to make sure that they can be successful in their roles, supporting those people who we're serving every day. And we gotta look out for that a lot.
So I guess how would you maybe potentially revamp the housing education that you received when you were in university now?
Yeah, so actually been doing some of that. So I mentioned I work with the Chartered Institute of Housing Canada. It's the umbrella association of educating housing professionals in the country. I was also a member of Chartered Institute of Housing 20 years ago when I was a housing student in Newcastle. 25, 28, aging myself now. Long time ago. But yeah, the Chartered Institute of Housing Canada has is got housing specific courses for those people who might be interested in a career in housing, or who are already working in housing and want to have a designation that directly gives them the recognized qualification in this industry. We actually rewrote all of the courses recently, and that was to include, like more modern examples of housing finance, more modern examples of the built environment. We also are putting together supplementary courses specifically on Indigenous housing, which we absolutely needed to do. We have a focus on trauma-informed practice. We're looking at of how we can do supplementary courses and training and education on not just the technical aspects of being a housing professional, like the built environment, finance, architecture, and all of that, but also really looking at educating people on those social issues and how we would look at that wraparound type service, as well as just housing as the base. So a lot of that qualification is changed.
All right, so a bit of a Wi-Fi glitch there. All is well now. So I guess we were kind of veering toward the end of our conversation today anyway, but I just have a couple
Mhm.
more questions just before I let you go. So the first one, because I always kind of wondered this myself, like, because I used to live in Calgary, in Airdrie, I guess, outside,
Mhm.
and you always drive through downtown, you see the big high-rise buildings that
Mhm.
are office buildings, because I think even in Edmonton, like the two or three biggest buildings now are apartments. Like
Yep.
they're very expensive, like high scale, whatever. Um, but what is the process, or is it as easy as everyone says to like turn old office buildings into living quarters? Because that seems to be a common thing people are saying since COVID, because everyone's working from home. Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, you would think it would be an easy thing to do, but I mean, office
Mhm.
buildings are built as office buildings because they were never intended to be homes. But
Exactly. Yeah.
so there's a lot of, in terms of logistics of updating and modernizing and making them livable. Sure, there's a huge amount of capital investment that would be needed to make that happen, but also a huge amount of plan and permission changes and the willingness to be able to do that. I believe we'll see it in the future.
Hmm.
I think there's that very obvious space between where is space and where there didn't used to be, and why aren't we building housing in it? I think it's a solid argument. I feel like it will
Hmm.
come. And we'll probably will see that in some city centers here soon. Um, in terms of how easy it is, probably not as easy as what you would think.
Yeah,
Um,
because I think people assume like you mean like the amount of plumbing. I don't know. I can't even imagine where
mm,
you would start of things you would need to
no.
update and change. And really, like, you have the shell of the building is what you have.
Yeah,
Like
you have the
everything
shell
kind of
of the
needs to
building,
be.
and everything has a door, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything behind that door would be appropriate for housing to happen. But
Mhm.
yeah, I think the argument is a sound one. I think the argument is that there's already a building in place and it already has the major infrastructure in it. Like it would have an elevator, it would have plumbing, it would have HVAC, it would have electricity. It would just be configuring all of that
Yeah,
to make it into housing. But in terms of investment, significant. Yeah.
yeah. I can't see it being as because I feel like I've always heard people just kind of generally saying, "Oh, we should just turn that into so and so." But I'm like, I don't think. I mean, I am definitely not an expert, but I
Yeah.
did never thought that would be
And
the case.
again, I'm no architect, but
Yeah.
seen enough renovation projects and modernization works to understand what goes into that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when I was doing kind of like, again, to even try to begin to research, trying to like our conversation today
Hmm.
is some of the questions I have. And I hope the questions have been at least all right. But I guess like I saw one thing and I assume that someone who is again like teaching social studies and kind of aware, you always see like very generic statements from academics about like what future goals are. Cause I guess my question to a lot of people, you've been working in a place for 30 years or if you've been a professor for 30 years, I'm like, what does the future of your research kind of look like? You even talked about like how do we plan for the future and like you
Hmm.
never would have predicted COVID coming and everyone working from home. But I saw this statement and it said policymakers need current, contextual, and relevant evidence to understand Canada's housing challenges and to design the most effective solutions. Like that is the most like broad thing
They're pretty
ever.
broad.
So I guess yeah, so it's obviously it sounds great. It makes you sound like you're very smart, which and I'm not trying to like say anything about the person who wrote this, but I guess my question is like, I don't have a better suggestion. Is kind of what I'm saying also. I guess my question to you would be now that you've kind of been 25 years in, if you had to like go back to the start of that housing degree and they said, "You know what? You will never actually work in housing. You're just going to be in academia the entire time." Like what would you research now to kind of like go the long
Yeah.
way with it?
No, that's an outstanding question. It's a tough one too because I
Mhm,
feel like my job touches so many different
mhm,
areas. I think what we'd be researching, we play a lot of we need to do better at looking what's around the corner. So in terms of that demographic planning and stuff, and and looking at patterns of the future and recognizing that housing isn't the same now as what it was 20 years ago, and how we moved on from 20 years to now, and how we need to move on in the next 20 years. And we're looking at I think what the sentence that you said is relevant, but it also becomes irrelevant very quickly because the
Yeah.
world changes so quickly. And, you know, we're looking right now at the demand is for family housing, but we know it's the demand is for, we also have a massive demand for single person housing, and student housing is lacking, and, you know, all of that. In terms of what would I research for the future would be, you know, we got to look at people are living longer. We got to look at what the
Mm-hmm.
needs of those folks are. Um, and we got to look at how we better combine funding. So an example of that would be, you know, there's funding for health, there's funding for housing, there's funding for justice, but we need to look at how we better plan all of those resources to get the most out of all of those different varying systems. So we know through recent research, that you spend $10 on housing, you're saving money on the justice system, you're saving money on
Yep.
health and social care, you're saving money on seniors accommodation, and, you know, you're saving money in various other different buckets of policing and everything else. I feel like we need to concentrate or we could concentrate more of our housing research on how those varying systems can work better together. And then it would be, okay, there isn't this bucket for, there's this bucket for operational housing, there's this bucket for capital investment in housing, there's this
Yeah.
bucket for emergency health services, there's this bucket for hospital discharge health services, there's a bucket for, you know, care in homes, and there's a very siloed way of looking
Yeah.
at how money is distributed for all of those different services. I feel like if we could concentrate now on researching how those systems interact, how those systems interweave, how, you know, the dollars that you spend in different areas will save you dollars in other areas, and where the best direction of that funding should be. I feel like we need to get better at that.
And even when you mentioned people are living longer, I often hear that older people are also not downsizing anymore. Is that like something that you guys consider as part of your like availability? I guess like I don't know how that would. I had that on my list here, but I didn't know how that would necessarily relate to
No,
your specific situation. But
it doesn't specifically relate, but it kind of does. Like there's affordable seniors housing in the city. There's a huge organization called Greater Edmonton Foundation in Edmonton, and they're actually the biggest landlord in the city. And they, you know, they cater to seniors who have potentially downsized or are living in affordable accommodations, but they just happen to live in seniors community housing or senior lodges, however, whatever the best choice is for them. Folks on downsizing, which means there's a lack of on the market housing for those folks who are in a position to buy. But also, we're in a situation where we have some people who live in housing that's too big for them, and that gives a shortage of housing for those folks who might need it. So we then have
yeah, I never thought about that.
yeah, we have to have some difficult conversations around, okay, our housing has been really good for you for the last 30 years. We maybe need to look at you moving somewhere smaller so that we can afford to get the next larger family in. So again, as much as,
Interesting.
you know, there's money available to build, there's also not money available to build. And, you know, we got to make best use of the housing stock that you have, which often means making sure that the right size families live in it.
Yeah, because you probably have a lot of people who are like older couples that maybe live in a 4 or 5 bedroom house.
Right.
That maybe like their family is already raised and gone, but they still have like these disposable rooms
Yeah.
they're not using, which can, yeah, that's interesting. I never really thought about that. But
Yeah, I was in
anyway,
interesting project
yeah.
back in Newcastle that specifically focused on that, and how we incentivize people to move out of their larger family homes into smaller bungalows or smaller accommodations that would be better suited for their situation into their old age. Yeah, and making sure that best use of the housing stock was all the rooms had somebody sleeping in them, you know, not just one of the rooms had someone sleeping in them. But it's an interesting
Because even
piece of work.
Well, yeah, as I say it, I realize both of my sets of grandparents both still live in the same home they've always lived in. So I
Right.
guess I'm not as removed from that as much as I thought. But anyway, thank you very much, Stacey Houston. This was an absolute pleasure having you on
Thank you.
today.
I appreciate your time. Thanks for having me.